The Zohar 1, the book and its author, from Gershom G. Scholem's Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism. He does not seem to have realized that the Hebrew of his day, which he tried to translate into Aramaic, totally differed as a language from that of the ancient books. With all his vast erudition, he was anything but a philologist, and with modern criticism can benefit a good deal from an analysis of his not infrequent howlers. In some instances, it is possible to show that he made use of the standard Hebrew and Aramaic dictionaries of the period. In other cases, he evidently employed expressions newly coined by himself, either in inventing completely new words or by altering old ones. And it is of some interest that the same 3 or 4 constants recur in most of these neologisms. Theth, Samek, and in particular, Kof. So that would be the Q. TH, S, that S and the Q. These peculiarities of language and style are uniformly present in every one of the 18 writings on our list, from the Midrash Ha-Nilam and the Idroth to the Mishnahs and the tracts on physiognomy. The Sifra de Tezet Utha, which some writers have assigned to remote antiquity, while offering the least proof of so far-reaching a thesis, is distinguished in nothing from the Aramaic sections of the Midrash Ha-Nilam, which, according to the same authorities, were written a long time after the main part of the Zohar. Everything that has been said of the vocabulary of the Zohar also applies to its phraseology, whether the style is elliptic and oracular or verbose and circumstantial. There is the same tendency to employ such words as all profundity, all completion, all connection, all configuration, all mystery, etc., expressions in which the word decola of the whole is tacked on to the substantive. Such expressions, although used a good deal by the Gnostics, are not to be found in the language of the ancient Jewish literature. In the literature of Kabbalism, their appearance in the wake of the Neoplatonic revival constitutes one of the most striking examples of the gradual penetration of Neoplatonic terminology into Kabbalism. Also, due to the same influence as the increasing vogue enjoyed by superlatives on the pattern of mystery of mysteries, bliss of blisses, depth of depths, etc., of which a large number are to be found in all parts of the Zohar. Another characteristic peculiarity of style which must be mentioned in this context is the author's predilection for oxymora and paradoxes. Rhetorical figures of speech, such as cooked and uncooked, also occur in the Talmud, but there they signify, in our instance, half-baked. The long list of similar expressions in the Zohar are usually employed to indicate that a certain act is of spiritual and impenetrable nature. It is, and is not signifies that something exists, as it were, only partly, but that its existence is of an exquisitely spiritual nature and cannot therefore be properly described. Whole sentences couched in grand and magniloquent style, which at first sight seem to be pure nonsense, are employed for the sole purpose of drawing the attention of the reader to what is to follow. So we see that Judaism by name, you could say, required a Greek influence, and I don't mean the fact that they that they came up with the name. There were certain elements of it, and surprise, surprise, when the Muslims started translating the Greek philosophic texts and such, it likewise caused some changes. Some things that we hear mentioned right there seem to have come from encounters with the Sufis, you could say. Or at least the change was likely, was more common, because of such things. Which is this serpent that flies in the air and walks alone, and meanwhile an ant, resting between its teeth, has the enjoyment beginning in community and ending in isolation? Which is the eagle whose nest is in the tree that does not exist? Which are his young which grow up but not among the creatures? Which were created in the place where they were not created? Which are those which they ascend, descend, and when they descend, ascend? Two which are one, and one which are three. Who is the beautiful girl on whom nobody has set his eyes, whose body is concealed and revealed? Who goes out in the morning and hides in the day? Who puts on the ornaments which are not there? Thus the old man, see item H of our list, begins his great discourse. The mystifying purpose is plain. It is also apparent in the not infrequent sentences containing some brief, impressive-sounding obituar dictum, which is not only in most cases entirely obscure, but which in many cases cannot even be properly construed grammatically. It is sometimes difficult to avoid the impression that the author was acting on the good old principle of appéter le bourgeois. However, that may be, his capacity for declamatory, pathetic, and sonorous prose was without doubt highly developed. It is undeniable that he was a sovereign master on the instrument which he himself had fashioned. These artifices of style also include a peculiar form of endiadius, by which special emphasis is placed on a notion through the negation of its opposite, hidden and not evident, sealed and not comprehensible, short and not long, the formula with which distinctions between different categories of the same general application are introduced are everywhere the same. Nor must the stereotyped homiletical phrases be forgotten, which are entirely foreign to the old midrash, and which the author has borrowed in part from the latter midrash, but chiefly from the stock of standing expressions habitually employed by the preachers of his age. This verse must be more closely examined. Now the time has come to reveal the meaning. Let us return to the earlier works, this that the friends have already dealt with. Typical cliches of this genre are to be found on almost every page. Compare with this style that of the Rhea, Mahemna, and the Tikkunim at once reveals an important difference. Here we evidently have before us a deliberate imitation of the uniform language of the other parts, but executed in a rather lame fashion and without any originality. The author of this group of writings knows vastly less Aramaic even than his predecessor. His use of words is quite preposterous, and the transcription largely limited to pure Hebrew with an aleph tacked on at the end in order to give a quasi-Aramaic appearance to the substantive. In place of many of the Aramaic expressions used in the magnum opus, there is an indiscriminate use of Hebraisms not to be found in the writings which he is trying to imitate. With 2 or 3 exceptions, he makes no use of new words peculiar to the vocabulary of the Zohar, and the same applies to the peculiarities of style just mentioned. The syntax is entirely different, and so are the formula with which the biblical verses or Talmudic quotations are introduced. The glamour which distinguishes the best passages of the Zohar in spite of the artificiality of their language. There is not a trace. Everything is pale and lifeless. On the other hand, there are no marked differences in style between the Rhea, Mahemna, and the Tikkunim, except perhaps that the style of the Tikkunim is even less distinguished than that of the Rhea, Mahemna. 4. If one turns from purely philological to literary criteria, the results are no different, whether it be the form or the content of the Zohar that is subjected to critical analysis. The conclusion to which one is led is invariably the same, namely that all those parts which I propose to call the real Zohar are to be defined as the work of one author, and that the Rhea, Mahemna, and Tikkunim must be regarded as an imitation of it. The first point that strikes one in Analyzing the literary form of the real Zohar is its particular stage setting. The Palestine, which is described in all parts, is not the real country as it existed, but an imaginary one. So far from proving that the Zohar originated in Palestine, the various topographical and sundry descriptions of the natural background of the miraculous actions and happenings attributed to Rabbi Simeon and his friends provide the most convincing proof possible that the author had never so much as set foot in Palestine, and that his knowledge of the country was derived entirely from literary sources, localities which owe their existence in literature to the misreading of medieval Talmudic manuscripts are selected as the stage of the mystical revelations. Whole villages are set up on the authority of some Talmudic passage, the meaning of which has eluded the author. The most characteristic example of this kind is the frequent mention of a place called Cappadocia, which for the author is not the province of Cappadocia in Asia Minor, but a village apparently in Lower Galilee, frequently visited by the adepts of their journeys. What the Zohar has to say about the character of its inhabitants leaves no doubt that, as Samuel Klein has shown, a passage from the Palestinian Talmud containing some rather unfriendly remarks on the Cappadocians in Sepphoris, i.e. the settlement of Cappadocian Jews in the town of Sepphoris, has prompted the author to found his mythical village of Cappadocia. This is on a par with his treatment of Palestinian topography, which he had evidently read a good deal in his Talmudic and Midrashic sources, but remembered only what suited his imagination. His descriptions of the mountains of Palestine, for example, are of the most romantic kind and accord far better with the reality of Castile than with that of Galilee. Much of the same applies to the fanciful treatment of the personalities of the narrative. Here again, the author's misconceptions are inexplicable on the assumption that he was drawing on ancient and authentic sources. Well, he could have been writing it that way for a purpose, which, if he was, honest about the origins, it would be even a greater text, The legend which he builds up in the Midrash Ha-Nilam and in the real Zohar around the figure of Simeon ben Yohai is fanciful in the last degree. He's even misunderstood the family relations of his hero. The famous saint Phineas ben Yair is mentioned in the Talmud as the son-in-law of Simeon ben Yohai, the author having evidently misread a word described him as his father-in-law. The name of the father-in-law of Eliezer, Rabbi Simeon's son, he seems to have changed deliberately. Nor is he worried by chronology, where it is a question of giving the names of the initiates who gathered around Simeon ben Yohai. He lets his imagination roam freely and introduces the names of Talmudic teachers who lived generations later. He even goes so far as to introduce the legendary figure of Rabbi Rumeh, which first appears as a Kabbalistic authority in the book Bahir, as a sort of older mystical colleague of Simeon ben Yohai, thereby involuntarily betraying the true historical position of the Zohar in relation to the book Bahir. The names of the most important members of the group around Simeon ben Yohai are largely taken from the pseudo-epigraphical Midrash and given a spurious appearance of authenticity by the addition of the name of the father or other cognomens. This particular Midrash, the Perkei Rabbi Eliezer, dating from the 8th century, is one of the most important sources for the Aggadah of the Zohar in general. As for the descriptions of the contemplative life led by the anchorites and mystics in the desert, it is possible to show that so far from describing, as Gaster assumed, the real conditions of Transjordan in the first centuries of the Christian era, the author simply made use of the description of hermits given by the Spanish Jewish moral philosopher Bahya ibn Bakuda on the basis of Arab mystical sources. In sharp contradistinction to the pseudo-realism, the scenery and the personalities of the Raya, Mahemna, and the Tikkunim show no attempt to describe the concrete situations in these latter writings. The tendency to obscure all earthly happenings and to transfer the stage from earth to heaven has completely triumphed. Not Palestine, however, romantically draped and disfigured, but the celestial house of learning provides the stage of the Raya Mahemna. Simeon ben Yohai is shown in conversation not with his pupils, Rabbi Abba, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Hizkiah, etc., but with Moses, the faithful shepherd, whose cognomen has suggested the title of the book, with an ancient of the ancients, with the prophet Elijah, with the Tanaites and Amoraites collectively, and finally, even with God himself. All this ites stuff, it tends to be een or eem ending words. Well, names, you know. It is plain that the author intended to write a sort of continuation of the Zohar, which he had, of course, read, the justification being that following the death of Simeon ben Yochai, his further revelations in heaven and among its residents from God to the spirits of the blessed remain to be dealt with. Well, some of it ends with the hey, but if you look at the Arabic, some of those had the dot, 2 dots over the hey, so you had the T sound. And in Hebrew, perhaps some of that rubbed over. The author significantly refers to the real Zohar, whose stage is the sublunary world, as the earlier work. His own contribution is independent of it in character and in the number of places, particularly in the Tikkunim. He actually introduces a sort of systematic commentary to Zoharic passages. Latin kind of has that T-E, T-I, you know, sort of ending with a vowel before it, a lot of times too, so. A close analysis of the Zohar's literary composition supplies further proof of the view set out in the preceding paragraphs. Its construction is, on the whole, regular and systematic, and exhibits certain recurrent characteristics. There is no difference between the structure of the various quasi-independent writings on our list and that of the numerous briefer compositions scattered throughout Part A, which outwardly imitates the form of the Midrash. It is evident that the author had no clear perception of the difference between the old Midrash, whose tradition he tried to carry on, and the medieval homily, which issued from his pen without his being aware of it. Like the old Midrashim, the Zohar follows the division of the Torah into sections for synagogal use. Within each section, Sidra, one finds introductions, systematic mystical midrash to certain verses, and scattered among these homiletic explanations, various literary compositions in the form of anecdotes, etc., referring to some subject mentioned in the Sidra. The personalities who figure in these pro-anecdotes or tales are frequently made to hold lengthy discourses whose construction is always the same as regards the introductions which precede the interpretation proper of the Torah verses. There is the same superficial imitation of the Midrash, usually in the form of taking a verse from the prophets or the hagiographa as the startling point and linking its interpretation with that of the Torah verse in question. But whereas the old Midrash, these introductions display a loose mosaic of authentic remarks and sayings, their imitations in the Zohar are really like homilies carefully built up with an eye to formal unity and coherence of thought. Even in those parts which purport to be independent writings, the development of the argument is always preceded by such homiletical introductions. Uniformity is also the mark of illustrative or explanatory excursions into storytelling. The same number of literary motifs is juggled in all of them. The figurants change, but the story remains the same. Of differences in the historical strata going beyond a period of a few years, there can be no question these stories are not only, as a rule, built up in strict accordance with certain archetypes, but they're also closely linked with each other and with the more loosely constructed homilies to the various verses of the Torah, both directly by cross-reference and by implication. Thus, it may happen that an idea developed in a story or introductory homily is simply continued in the subsequent midrash, and vice versa. The further one carries an analysis of these cross-references and implications, the general form of the arguments and their architectural structure, the more clearly does one perceive that long passages have been written on the spur of the moment and occasionally under the spell of inspiration. Subsequently, on reading through what he had written, the author makes certain emendations and corrections, including cross-references where he found them advisable. When all the facts are fairly considered, there is never any proof that these subsidiary notes amount to more, i.e., that they are traceable to independent sources. The lengthy chapters on the history of the patriarchs and the first 200 pages of the Zohar on Leviticus are instances of such parts composed at a single stretch. Here and there one encounters a brief passage whose genuine connection with the rest might conceivably seem doubtful, but such passages are never of particular importance for the subject matter. It is part of the same general picture that the author tends to repeat himself. Occasionally he goes so far as to introduce the same passage in different contexts, but as a rule he prefers to vary the same idea. But whenever that happens, we are plainly dealing with homiletical variations on one subject and not with a plurality of writers. 5. Finally, we come to the important question of the literary sources of which the author has made use. Again, one is struck by the uniformity of the picture. Although the same sources are not constantly used throughout, one obtains a fairly clear impression of his library. I do not mean to imply that in the actual process of writing he surrounded himself with books to which he constantly went for reference. It is more probable that, being an omnivorous reader, gifted with an excellent memory, and having moreover made an extensive study of certain writings, he was able to quote more or less textually from memory, in the manner generally accepted in the Middle Ages. Now and then, of course, memory failed him, and the resultant inaccuracies and errors are sometimes very illuminating. Among the writings which must be regarded as his principal sources are the Babylonian Talmud, the Midrash Rabbah in various parts, the Midrash to the Psalms, the Pesach Toth, and the Perkei Rabbi Eliezer, and also the Targumim and Rashi's commentary to the Bible and the Talmud. Over and above these, there emerges a long list of other writings of which use is made more occasionally, as Bacher or Batcher has shown in a brilliant essay on the subject. He drew heavily upon the medieval scriptural commentators. More than that, it is possible to show that he also made use of the main writings of Jehuda Halevi. There's also a Halevi Sufi order, so, I guess one branch of the family went one way and one went the other, but no, it could be completely different. Who knows? People came up with last names that weren't related, that ended up being the same. And Moses Maimonides, and that some of his ideas on questions of the first order, which were among his favorite subjects, are directly based on the views of Maimonides, such as, for instance, his frequent references to paganism. I'm not sure what they mean by paganism other than non-Jewish religion, as a form of astral worship closely linked with magic and idolatry. To this can be added that he has clearly made use of 13th century of the Common Era literature, both Hasidic and Kabbalistic, and in particular he has drawn freely upon the writings published by the school of Kabbalists whose center was the little Catalan town of Gerona, and who, between the years 1230 and 1260, did more than any other contemporary group to unify and consolidate what was pregnant and living in the Kabbalism of Spain. There can be no doubt that the writings of Ezra ben Solomon, Azriel, and of Moses ben Nahman, the leading figure of this group, influenced him not only generally, but also down to certain particular details of his own doctrine. The latest ascertainable source of a highly important terminus technicus adopted by the Zohar is Joseph Gikatila's Gnath Agaz, the Nut Garden, which was written in 1274. This book is the source both of the term used to describe the primordial point, our mystical center, which one encounters in widely separated parts of the Zohar, and of the highly original manner in which the conception of the primordial point is linked with that of the primordial Torah, conceived as the wisdom of God. Naturally, these sources are not mentioned. Instead, the author contents himself and discontents the reader with vague references to ancient writings or mystical tracts dealing with the same topics. Thus, the discovery of the real sources, which he is so careful to obscure, is one of the main prerequisites for a correct appreciation of the historical and doctrinal significance of the Zohar. The task is made all the more intricate and amusing because the author not only fails to indicate his real sources, but supplies fantastic references to non-existent ones. The whole book is full of fictitious quotations and other bogus references to imaginary writings, which have caused even serious students to postulate the existence of lost sources for the mystical parts of the Zohar. But these quotations from the book of Adam, the book of Enoch, the book of King Solomon, the book of Rav, Hamnuna, Sava, etc., we owe to a writer with a sense of humor. The publication of a catalog of this library from the upper world are entirely of a piece with the context in which they stand, both in style and terminology, and as a rule, they are part of the argument as well. It is only in very rare cases that these references do actually refer to an existing book, and whenever that happens, the document in question is the very reverse of a text of hoary antiquity. The alphabet of Ben Sira, a very late text, 10th century, the Common Era, from which the author has obviously taken the myth of Lilith as Adam's first wife, is a case in point. Not in a single instance are we confronted with genuine quotations from earlier writings which have since disappeared. Now, earlier versions of the Lilith and Lilene sort of references, it was clear that Lilith was, that they weren't human. That was a different type of creation altogether. The same independence of mind characterizes the author's treatment of his sources. As often as not, he displays a sovereign contempt for the literal text, using it freely as plastic material for his own constructive purposes, and giving free rein to his imagination in making vital changes, emendations, and reinterpretations of the original. His favorite method is to take the motifs of the old Aggadah and weave them into his own fabric of thought, even where he does not convert their meaning into outright mysticism. Such excursions into Aggadic legends nowhere else found in this form are therefore not necessarily based on lost writings. Their source is simply the author's own imagination. His treatment of such subjects is characterized by a tendency towards dramatization, equally apparent in the architecture of whole compositions and in the manner in which brief Talmudic stories or legends are converted into lively Aggadah on the same subject, where an Aggadah already contains mystical elements. These are, of course, duly emphasized and occasionally woven into an entirely new myth. In all this busy reinterpretation of old material, the author displays a passion for his subject and a naivety which are not among the least peculiar of his characteristics as a writer. One may explain them by recalling that for all his familiarity with the elements of medieval Jewish culture and his own frequent development of profoundly mystical and dialectical ideas, the author's spiritual life is centered, as it were, in a more archaic layer of the mind. Again and again, one is struck by the simultaneous presence of crudely primitive modes of thought and feeling, and of ideas whose profound contemplative mysticism is transparent, and it is perhaps noteworthy that the two harmonize better than might be imagined. There cannot be even a question of relating them to different literary sources. What we have before us is the reflection of their living conflict in the mind of a very remarkable personality in whom, as in so many mystics, profound and naive modes of thought existed side by side. Well, if people are profound one way, sometimes they're inferior other ways. It's like, even if it's overall. It may be observed here that the author of the Zohar is not the only 13th century Kabbalist who displays this peculiar and fruitful combination of seemingly divergent traits, though there is hardly another writer of the period whose personality is of such arresting interest to us. It must be borne in mind that by his outlook, and probably also through personal relations, he belonged to a group of writers in Spain, and more particularly in Castile, who might be described as the representatives of the Gnostical reaction in the history of Spanish Kabbalism. The Kabbalah of the early 13th century was, the Common Era, was the offspring of a union between an older and essentially Gnostical tradition represented by the book Bahir and the comparatively modern element of Jewish Neoplatonism. The growing influence of the latter in turn provoked a reaction which naturally stressed the Gnostical elements of the Kabbalistic outlook. In the second half of the 13th century, this tendency was represented by such writers as the brothers Isaac and Jacob, HaKohen of Zoria, Todros ben Joseph Abulafia of Toledo, and Moses ben Simon of Burgos. We still have a number of their writings, and it is not difficult to detect in them, particularly in those of the last two mentioned, a mood which is closely related to that of the Zohar, although they possess hardly any of the glamour and originality which distinguishes that great work. To return to our critical examination of the Zohar's sources, the statement that the use which the author makes of older literary material is consistent and uniform throughout is also true if we consider that the material ideas which belong to the general consciousness of the epoch rather than to specific writers. The category includes, for example, the liturgy, which the Zohar takes for granted in dealing with the mysticism of prayer, and which is without any doubt that current in Spain during the 12th and 13th centuries of the Common Era. The same is true of the frequent references to popular Jewish usages, the customary forms of polite intercourse, which are here treated as natural, the author's ideas on the subject of medicine, and above all his views on sorcery, magic, and demonology, which plays an important part in his doctrine. The constituent elements of his theory of magic are clearly traceable to the popular medieval views on the subject, though leavened with a strong dose of personal fancy. A detailed analysis of the resultant conception of magic could hardly fail to be of considerable interest, for the power of evil is a problem which exercises special fascination upon his mind, and as I shall try to show in the following lecture, it forms one of the main subjects of his writings, both in their theoretical and in their homiletical aspects, in the same manner between some of the basic ideas of his eschatology, such as the distinction between an earthly and heavenly paradise, are in conformity with Jewish and Christian beliefs of the time, part 6. And what has been said of his style and his attitude toward the heritage of Jewish thought is true also of his own doctrines. Here again, the various parts of the real Zohar form a whole, distinct from the Reya, Mahemna, and the Tikkunim. Of the substance of these ideas are, at any rate, of some of the most important of them. I shall have something to say in the following lecture. Here we are concerned with their bearing upon the question of the authorship of the Zohar, and the point which must be stressed before all others is the fact that the line of thought which runs through all these writings is constant in spite of occasional minor contradictions. The mystical terminology is virtually the same throughout, representing as it does a development of the terminology employed by the Kabbalist of the Geronese school. The mass of symbols follow a more or less uniform rule, so much that it would be possible to interpret them in detail even if we had no other document of early Kabbalism than the Zohar. The same fundamental symbolic configurations are repeated in innumerable times in various forms, and what is chiefly alluded to in one place is lengthily explained in another. And, well, glossing over the problems of the Bible has led to a lot more faith than some other stuff, right?